If you're just joining us for this third chapter of Zephaniah, it will not make as much sense to you unless you've heard the first and the second. The second is on RTN. It'll be going on Moriel TV tomorrow. The first is up on both RTN and Moriel, and we'll be hopefully concluding tonight the book of Zephaniah, which has the idea of being hidden. Now let's understand certain things once again that we've touched on, but need to put back in perspective before we go into chapter 3. The first thing is, always remember, we have to always keep in mind, all of Israel's prophets prophesied for 3 different time frames. They all prophesied for their own time or the events in their near future. They prophesied for the first coming of Christ, and they prophesied for the second coming of Christ. They all do that. There's nothing in the Old Testament that does not have a prophecy about Jesus, not a single book in his first coming. And there's not a book that does not have some kind of prophecy about his second coming. But they all, of course, speak of their own time. Where you have variation, though, is the proportion. The proportion. The book of Zephaniah speaks of the prophet's own time, but that's second. It gets the second most amount of verses. It talks about the first coming of Jesus or predicts certain things. For instance, the defilement of the temple in chapter 1, verse 9. Those who leap on the temple threshold to fill the house of their Lord with deceit and violence and so on. Well, we know that happened twice when Jesus said, "You filled my Father's house with deceit," and all these kind of things. You know, it's there. His first coming is there. But that's tertiary in terms of the proportion. So things about his first coming are tertiary. Things about the prophet's own time, Zephaniah's own time, which we'll come to in a second, are secondary. What's interesting about Zephaniah is it's the second coming of Christ, the return of Christ, the day of the Lord, the close of the age, that's primary. It's the future prophetic meaning for the close of the age that accounts for what most of the verses are focused on. Yes, obviously, there's things for his first coming. So, there's things, and it's there. And there's things for his own, the prophet's own time, just before the Babylonian captivity. Those things are conspicuously there. But the most emphasis in the book is on things that are to take place at the close of the age. We have to remember that. Now, let's look a little bit further at this. There are 2 continuous threads or streams throughout the book of Zephaniah. One is the one of judgment and coming judgment and the inevitability of the judgment. But the other is the faithful remnant who will be hidden from these things if they stay faithful. A future hope and a promise for them. All throughout the book, every time he prophesies and predicts what is going to happen, that is of a negative nature, both for his own time and for the close of the age, you'll find he always comes back to a promise for the faithful people, to the people who he's really appealing to. Right from chapter 1, we see this. Chapter 2, verse 3, "Seek the Lord, O you humble of the earth, who've carried out his ordinances." It goes on and on. Verse 9, "My people will inherit them." We continue looking at chapter 3 tonight. It goes into a long diatribe about the sin of the nation, both present, that is Zephaniah's time, and what's going to happen at the close of the age. But it always keeps coming back to this promise for the faithful remnant, for the faithful people. It's the closing theme is never the judgment itself, but the hope for those who serve the Lord. Okay. Now, remember this time and the end time will be characterized by two things. In chapter 1, verse 6, we see the following. Those who have turned back from following the Lord. It is a time of massive backsliding. There was a massive national backsliding at the time of Zephaniah before the Babylonian captivity. And there will be a massive time of backsliding, both within the apostate church and, of course, Israel, before the day of the Lord and before, again, Babylon the Great. A massive time of backsliding. But it is also a time when people took on what would later be known as a philosophy of deism. Deism was held by people like the American President Thomas Jefferson. He acknowledged that there was a God, but God does not involve himself directly in the affairs of men. He just says, get on with it. I gave it to you. Whatever happens is your fault. Whatever you make of it, good or evil, is going to be by you and not by divine intervention. This was the thinking, but it did not begin. It did not begin with Thomas Jefferson or with deism. It's a much older way of thinking. They say, the people who say that the Lord will not do either good or evil, this kind of thinking in verse 12 of chapter 1, they're stagnant in spirit. He's not going to get involved in our situation. He's just going to let things happen. And people who were good people, who were faithful to the ordinance of God, themselves began to become disillusioned, saying, oh, God is not helping us. God is not letting anything happen that's causative. He's just letting it happen. He's not intervening. They saw the world events unfolding. They saw the nation going a certain way. They had been praying. The faithful people had been praying, but things just continued. And it didn't seem like God was active in history. It did not seem like God was active in history. The backsliders didn't care about it. They just assumed he wasn't active in history. But the faithful people were beginning to become, or had become, almost despondent. God's not going to do anything. Now, remember verse 6. It's a time of backsliding. What we know from the superscription, the time he wrote, chapter 1, verse 1, it was in the reign of Josiah. It was at a time when there was a period of respite and a time when there would be a revival, a final revival before the axe falls. Once a nation goes too far, the most they can hope for is a final revival before the axe falls, but the axe must fall. We also see something else in chapter 2 of the book. The people were in a situation where other empires had fallen. Other empires had fallen, and their thinking was pretty much like the fall of Nineveh in verse 13 of chapter 2. He will make Nineveh a destruction parched in the wilderness. Other nations fell before their nation. His judgment had already begun on these other nations. Assyria fell. Babylon took their place. Okay? And more falling other nations were coming. Well, that's what we live in. We're going to see, or we have been seeing since the early decades of the 20th century, the fall of empires. It doesn't matter if it's the French Empire, the British Empire, doesn't matter if it's the Soviet Empire. We're seeing the fall of empires. Now, of course, the United States, the Republic has fallen. We've seen the fall of these empires. But ultimately, prophetically, it'll end with God's dealing with Israel. He always deals with the other nations in relation to Israel in some way. Anyway, with this in view, let's look, please, to Zephaniah chapter 3. Woe to her who was rebellious and defiled, the tyrannical city. She heeded no voice. She accepted no instruction. She did not trust in the Lord. She did not draw near to her God. Her princes within her are roaring lions. Her judges are wolves at evening. They leave nothing for the morning. Her people are reckless, treacherous men. Her priests have profaned the sanctuary. They've done violence to the law, the Torah. The Lord is righteous within her. He will do justice. Every morning he brings his justice to light. He does not fail, but the unjust knows no shame. A society that becomes devoid of any sense of recrimination for its moral decline, for its perversions, for its injustices, for its sins. There is no sense of shame. There's no sense of acrimony. There's no sense of any of these things. It's just acceptable. Well, just look at today. Divorce and remarriage with no scriptural reason even happens among Christians. Many people who profess to be Christian. Of disgrace. When I was first saved in the 1970s, early 70s, when I first met the Lord, and for a few years after that, I knew people who were divorced and remarried before they got saved. And I knew people who got saved and their unsaved husband or their unsaved wife left them and took off with somebody, and they remarried a believer. I knew cases like that. But two saved Christians, two born-again believers getting divorced. I didn't know anybody like that. I didn't know anybody who knew anybody like that. I'd never heard of such a thing. That was the world. That was Hollywood. Christians didn't do that. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. You can go to churches. I mean churches that say they're evangelical. And it's not a case where the unbeliever left the believer. Or it's not a case of something that happened where there was a divorce and a remarriage before they became Christians and all things are new. I've just seen two Christians arbitrarily getting divorced and going. I know pastors like that, pastors of churches who are in ministry, who are divorced and remarried with zero biblical grounds for doing so. There's no sense it's wrong. Now it's gone beyond that. Certainly in Great Britain with people like Steve Chalk, in America with people like Steve Greer, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Tony Campolo, particularly Greer and Chalk in Britain, openly accepting homosexuals, saying that we're a gay-friendly church. Well, you can be friendly to people who are homosexuals. You can be friendly to homosexuals, but you can't be friendly to homosexuality. It's an abomination. You can be friendly to homosexuals, but not to homosexuality. But this is in the church now. This is in churches where people actually claim to be saved, claim to be born again. And even in the church, there is a declining sense that it's wrong. There is no sense of recrimination, guilt, shame about it. None. It's become socially and culturally acceptable in the world, and it's become socially and culturally acceptable even in the church. Now, with God's eye, it's also Israel. It's also Israel. You have one of the biggest homosexual and lesbian festivals in the world in Tel Aviv. One of the biggest. There's a reason why the book of Revelation, alluding to Jerusalem, says Sodom and Egypt. Sodom, only Jerusalem, Sodom, where the Lord was also crucified. It's the church and it's Israel. We have to understand what Zephaniah means, first of all, for Israel and the Jews, before we can understand what elements of it apply to the church. Now you see, Zephaniah is speaking specifically to Judah, the kingdom of Judah. Okay, speaking to the Hebrews, but then the prophecies become extended to the other nations. Keep saying to the nations, to the nations. I'll gather the nations. Well, it's the same thing, nations and Gentiles. That's what the word means, goyim in Hebrew, ethnon in Greek. Okay, so you must always establish what it means first for Israel before you can correctly understand what it means for the church. Be careful of people who don't do that, who just take the Old Testament and apply it to the church, to the negation of what it actually means in the Sitzumleben, or in the setting it was actually written. We have to understand what it meant for Zephaniah's time, to understand what it means for our time, and we have to understand what it means for Israel and the Jews before we can understand what it means for the church and the Gentile nations as well. Okay? Now, let's look at it. Once again, in chapter 3, they accept no instruction. They did not trust in the Lord. They did not draw near to God. Much like Micah, he's prophesying judgment. It's an imprecatory prophecy. It's known as imprecatory prophecy. He's prophesying judgment at a time when people thought there was revival. Josiah had come. Now things are going to get cleaned up. Now things are going to be made right. The reign of Josiah was an interim period of respite, like the reign of Donald Trump. Donald Trump was pro-life, and he was pro-Israel and so forth. There might be interim periods of respite up to a point. But Zephaniah ignores this. He ignores it on any kind of a national level. He ignores it. He's only interested in the faithful people of God. He's not interested in the rest. Well, it's the same. What you see happening now to the United States at the moment, or happening in Europe with Brexit, the focus of God is always, one, those nations in relationship to Israel, and two, the faithful believers within it. His primary focus is never on the nations themselves. Now let's look at this. Chapter 3. Her prophets are reckless. Her judges are wolves, and her prophets are reckless. On the United States Supreme Court, the judges are wolves. These are wolves. Wolves. The same Supreme Court that in the 19th century issued the Dred Scott decision. And it said, effectively, by legal legislating from the bench, by legal decree, that black slaves are less than human. A black was declared, in effect, to be 3/5 of a human being in the 19th century in the American South, and it came to the Supreme Court, and the Dred Scott decision was upheld. It subhumanized blacks. When you get to the 20th century, they subhumanize human embryos. Now, they ignored the scientific evidence. They ignored the scientific evidence that blacks were fully human. And they ignore the scientific evidence that embryos are surviving younger and younger, earlier and earlier in gestation. And with the advances in neonatology and so forth, you have babies surviving younger and younger from premature births. They just ignore the scientific facts. The judges, the courts, issue legal decisions that are, in fact, political decisions. They're not based on any evidentiary premise. They're not based on scientific reality. They're not based on factual reality. They're based on political expediency, and political expediency is always influenced by something economic. Political expediency is always influenced by something economic. And this is something that Zephaniah surely highlights. He talks about the people who their only real interest is in materialism, in their properties, their houses, the vineyards, and so forth. They're trying to invest in material, financial interests, things of this nature. That is what is driving them and motivating them, and they put that first. They look at that above all other things. What is in my interest? Therefore, that is in my political interest if it's in my economic interest. The law, the Torah, the word of God be damned. That's the way it is. That's just the way it is. The judges are like wolves. I'm not saying all judges, but I'm saying the legal establishment. The judges are wolves at evening. The princes within her are roaring lions. Just look at the American Congress and the American Senate today. Donald Trump has a week left in office and they want to impeach him. They're like roaring lions. They're like roaring lions. They're just like animals with rabies. I read something in the news yesterday that there were gorillas in the zoo in San Diego, California, who the veterinarians diagnosed with COVID-19. There were actually 2 monkeys diagnosed with COVID-19 yesterday. I guess they didn't wear masks and practice social distancing or something. Nobody knows what to believe anymore. Nobody knows what to believe. What do you want to do? Make the monkeys wear the mask? I sponsor a kid in Uganda at an orphanage for AIDS orphans that our ministry is associated with. It's not a Moriel work, but it's connected to Moriel. And I have a kid there named Andrew. I'm his sponsor as far as his education and medical treatment and things like this. And I was Skyping with him and with the directress, a wonderful believer from America, yesterday about his health and all this. And she told me COVID is rampant in Uganda. It's rampant in Uganda. Well, how can it be then that there doesn't seem to be so much COVID coming from the third world as there is in the developed world? Well, if you've been to the third world, you know why. In the third world, screening and the standards of public health and monitoring are much, much lower, of a much lower grade and much lower quantity in proportion to the population. If you're not screening for it, you're not finding it. But in the developed world, it's the opposite. Okay. They screen for it, and they say it's increasing. Well, it's increasing because you're screening more people. You just don't know what to believe anymore. You can't take them at face value of what they say. The princes are corrupt. They're like mad lions. You know, if you've been to Africa, you know, I was at a game preserve in Africa with my friend who's now with the Lord. And I wasn't there at the time, but shortly before we were there, he talked to these game wardens in Afrikaans. And they were black guys, but they spoke Afrikaans. And they told them about a couple of weeks before, some Japanese tourists I shouldn't laugh. They got out of their vehicle with cameras to photograph lions. And guess what the lions did? The lions devoured them. You know, well, when you're princes, when the leaders of a society and a nation are like lions, you can't trust people like that. You can't believe people like that. You can pray for governments, but what does the scripture mean when you wind up saturated by an evil government. Well, let's understand what Paul says concerning this. Concerning this issue, we should pray for leaders and we should pray for them. If you look at what it's saying is, he says we should pray for them that we may lead quiet and peaceable lives. I pray for Mr. Biden. What's my prayer for Mr. Biden? That he leaves us alone. That he doesn't turn the engines of state and the guns against Christians. That's my prayer for Joe Biden. That's my only prayer for Joe Biden. He's a wicked man. He's pro-abortion. He's pro the whole same-sex thing. He's a wicked man. He's in all likelihood going to hell. In all likelihood, he will spend eternity in the lake of fire. I believe we've gotten to a Jeremiah 28 kind of situation where God says, don't even pray for these people. Now, I say that only for myself, not for everyone else, but these are like lions. Oh, but you should pray for the leaders. Yeah, pray that they leave you alone. Talk to Christians who are in countries where the church is persecuted, like China or Vietnam, or the way it used to be in Eastern Europe. Pray that they leave us alone, that we may live peaceable lives. When I pray for these politicians, the governments, those in authority, I pray that they leave us alone, because Satan is the god of this world. He's animating these corrupt political forces. Now, again, they're driven by some kind of material self-interest. I've tried to explain this, and I did explain it, I think, on our catching up this week. What you have is the new economy versus the old economy. I don't want to. You'd have to watch the webcast. But I explained very briefly that Karl Marx was fundamentally wrong about most things. But he was right about one thing, that when you have a change in the forces of production and power goes from one to another, there's going to be some kind of a revolution. Okay, now he misinterpreted it and all this stuff, but he said that because England was the first capitalist country, communism would begin in England. Just as Europe went from feudalism to capitalism, it will go from capitalism to communism. But it would happen in England first because he was a Darwinist. England was the most evolved country economically and politically. Therefore, it would begin in England, he said. Now, he was fundamentally wrong. It did not begin in England. It began in Russia, the last of the feudal countries. He was fundamentally wrong in what he said. But he knew when there was a change in the production. So you look now. You look at the increase in personal wealth of Elon Musk, who's now overtaken Jeff Bezos. He's nearly $200 billion. $200 billion. You look at who is benefiting from the lockdown. Oh, all these businesses are going bust and these businesses are going bankrupt and supermarket chains are in trouble and department store chains are in trouble and Macy's is in trouble, all of these things. The department stores on Oxford Street in London are all in trouble. Well, yeah, that's true. Selfridges is in trouble. They're in trouble. Who's benefiting? Amazon. Somebody else is going to benefit. The people who will benefit from it, they're happy to let the hotel and airline industries die. They're happy to let things from the old economy die if it's in their interest. But they've got the interest. They've got the money. They buy the political influence. They shut down the website, the Facebook account of Senator Rand Paul, the libertarian. They shut down the president of the United States They just a half dozen companies controlling social media make this decision. They're in political control. Is it democracy? No, it's not democracy. Is it communism? Well, no, it's not communism. Well, what is it? It's a monopolistic blend of socialism and a market economy. It's new people looking for power. And they will get the political vassals to serve their interest. That's always what it was. Now, again, I'm not trying to politically editorialize, but let's look at something. When Barack Obama was a senator, before he became president, he blocked legislation in the Senate in the United States to deal with the impending crisis of subprime lending. He was one of the main people responsible for what happened in 2008. One of the main people in the Senate. Then he becomes president. Not one of those bankers went to jail. He bailed out the banks with the Fed. He bailed out the banks with the Fed. That's what he did. Too big to fail, that kind of thing. Well, seeing this happening, the forerunner of Antifa was something called Occupy Wall Street. And they were complaining about Wall Street and the banks. But they were all voting for Obama, the very puppet of the banks who did these things where they were lending, the government was lending money at 0% interest to these banks, and the banks were lending it out to people at 4 and 5%. They were just lining their pockets, and Obama and the Fed made it possible. Yet people thought he was their champion. Afro-American unemployment was horrible under Obama, but Afro-American family income average after 2 terms, after 8 years of Obama, went down by $900. The average Black American family's income went down by $900 after 8 years of Barack Obama. Well, he bailed out the banks at the taxpayers' expense. What did he do for his own people? Put them on the breadline? Yeah, he did. He did. You look at post-colonial Africa. Post-colonial Africa. Apartheid was unjust and racist. But what they've had to replace apartheid is worse. It's worse. Blacks in South Africa are much worse off now. In terms of longevity and mortality, it's worse now than it ever was. Every one of those countries, Kenya, Tanzania, take your pick, all of those countries were better off under the British. And I'm not a colonialist. But of course, if you say this, they say you're a racist. All these governments are corrupt. Africa runs by tribalism. Africa runs by tribalism. The social injustice in Africa is worse than anything you'll find in Europe or America. Far worse. But nobody says anything. It's not the narrative. The princes are like lions. These governments are all corrupt. They're all driven by select interests. They stopped caring about what the Word of God said about many things, certainly morality and certainly justice. Now, I'm not trying to politically pontificate here. I'm simply trying to interpret what is happening now in light of what happened then. It was the same kind of thing. Her judges are wolves, and her princes are like roaring lions. Corrupt political leaders and a corrupt judiciary. Completely corrupt. That's what it's completely corrupt. The European Court in Strasbourg, you believe in that thing for justice, you want to have your head examined. It's all political. But let's look. She's become a desolation, a resting place for beasts. Everyone who passes by her will hiss and wave his hand in contempt. Her prophets are reckless and treacherous. Her priests have profaned the sanctuary. They've done violence to the law. The Lord is righteous within her. He will do no injustice. Every morning he brings his justice to light. He does not fail, but the unjust knows no shame. Now look at this. It says the cities, they're just left there. They're just left in desolation. A couple of weeks ago, I drove through London. England, a city where I've lived for years, a city where I used to come as a kid from New York. I'd come to London. I know London very well. It's not the same London. It was desolate. I've got family and friends in New York. We have an affiliated church in New York. It's desolate. It's just all being left to desolation. What people don't see is it's a consequence of their sin. Oh no, it's because of COVID. How come China dealt with COVID very quickly and didn't tell anybody else, and Wuhan is not closed down like New York and London is? You understand? Or New York and London are. Now, they've got other problems there, but who knows? Let's look. Once you see the national leaders, and you see the judiciary corrupt, forget about it. Chapter 3, verse 3. Verse 4, her prophets are reckless, treacherous men, and her priests have profaned the sanctuary. Again, just like in the first coming of Christ, her prophets are treacherous men. Well, not for the first time. What was Pat Robertson prophesying about the American election? That man's a proven false prophet. But there's still people who will listen to him. Sid Roth, man's out of his mind. These are proven false prophets. On the basis of Deuteronomy 18, etc., they predict time-specific things in the name of the Lord that categorically fail to happen. And then people will come back and listen to them some more, knowing that they're false prophets, wanting to have their ears tickled. They'll go back and listen deliberately to people who even common sense dictates should be ignored. Even common sense dictates that. Unsaved people know that these guys are clairvoyants and con artists. Unsaved people know what these people are. And unfortunately, in the politics of American evangelicism and the political influence of evangelical Christians, a lot of these crackpots had influence on the Trump administration. He was listening to a lot of these crackpots. Well, the prophets, they're running around doing crazy things. They're reckless, treacherous men. You think of CNN, CBN, the Christian Broadcasting Network in America. That was begun with something called the 700 Club. 700 Christians giving $10 a month to begin a Christian broadcasting network. It was built by the donations of Christians. Somehow it wound up being sold commercially. Where did the money go? Guess. There's the false prophet. He's still at it. Now, what right do we have to complain about Kamala Harris or Chuck Schumer or Joe Biden? What right do we have to complain about rigged vote counting. When we let these people run wild in the church, we won't even stand up to corruption in the church. Where's the salt and light? How's the church going to have an influence on the society? Oh, the courts are corrupt and the government's corrupt. The princes are like lions. The judges are like wolves. Yes, I agree. But the prophets are reckless, treacherous, and the clergy have profaned the Lord's sanctuary. They've done violence to the Torah, to the Word of God. The Lord is righteous within her. He'll have no injustice. Every morning he brings his justice to light. He doesn't fail. But the unjust knows no shame. It is not just the society that are shameless in their behavior, in their moral depravity. It's not just the society anymore. It's the nation Israel, and it's the church. Remember, the modern state of Israel has killed more Jewish children than Adolf Hitler. The Nazis killed about 1.5 million Jewish children. The nation of Israel, with non-therapeutic abortion on demand, has surpassed that long ago. Long ago. Who needs a Hitler when you got Jews to do it for you? Then they talk about justice. Justice. In the United States, they just elected a senator who says he's a minister of religion, a clergyman, Raphael Warnock in Georgia, who's one of the most militantly pro-abortion figures in the United States. Most of those abortion clinics are in and around black communities. What are you talking about? White privilege and institutional racism. You're murdering your own children wholesale. In some states, 7 out of 10 aborted fetuses are black. What are you complaining about white people? You're murdering your own kids. Israel's guilty. The nations are guilty. It is unbelievable. It's only the Lord. The unjust know no shame. Verse 6, I've cut off nations. Their corner towers are in ruins. In other words, the things that cities were the fortresses where people took refuge during times of invasion and war, and the corner towers were the bulwark that held the rest of the walls in place. They were the strongest places that made the rest of the city strong. They were the corners. Well, the very foundations, the very cornerstones of nations are being destroyed. It goes on, I have made their streets desolate, with no one passing by. Their cities are laid waste, without a man, without an inhabitant. I'm in England. Post office open half day, FedEx open half day. Banks sometimes open half day. I go to the pharmacy and go to a clinic, and I can go grocery shopping and I can get petrol. That's it. That's it. Hardly any traffic. Cities are desolate. There's nobody in them. Nobody's shopping. Restaurants are closed down, out of business. It's all desolate. This is what happened in the days of Zephaniah. It's what happened now. You got corrupt governments, corrupt courts, desolate cities, because you've got a corrupt religious leadership run by false prophets and self-serving clergy. I'm not saying it's all of them, but it predominates. I've been warning about the money preachers since the 1970s. I remember Dave Hunt and Corey ten Boom first spoke out against them. I've been warning about these. I can't tell you how many people said, you're unloving, you're judgmental, you're being critical, or if they're wrong, let the Lord deal with them. You shouldn't stand up and oppose false prophets. Zephaniah never should have been written. Jeremiah never should have been written. They should have sat down and let the Lord deal with it. Well, the Lord will deal with it. But that doesn't mean we don't warn people, that we don't correctly identify what they are, what they're doing, and what the consummate result of their actions are going to be if you continue to let them get away with it. But then it goes on. The cities are laid waste, no one passing by, without a man, without an habitation. I said, surely you will revere me, accept instruction. That's God's hope. So her dwelling will not be cut off, according to all I have appointed concerning her. But they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. Therefore wait for me, declares the Lord. For the day when I rise up as a witness, indeed my decision is to gather nations, to assemble kingdoms, and to pour out on them my indignation, all of my burning anger, for all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. For then I will give to the peoples purified lips, that all of them may call on the name of the Lord, to serve him shoulder to shoulder. If you were to look at the United States, the cities, and again, I'm not a Republican, and I'm not a Democrat, I'm an independent. I'm an independent pro-life voter. Okay. I'm no party affiliation or interest in political parties. If you look at the cities who voted consistently for liberal Democrats and things like this, and gave them power over a period of years, look what happened to Detroit. Look what happened to Baltimore. These were major, major cities at one time. Now you can go neighborhoods and abandoned buildings, nobody living in them, nobody wanting anything to do with them. And now they vote for these same politicians nationally. Okay, well, you destroyed Detroit and you destroyed Baltimore, now let's destroy Los Angeles and New York and Washington. This isn't only thinking about the short-term interest. Now I'm picking on America. Just look at England. Look what happened in England when you had the same thing with the industrialization. Look what happened to Bradford. Look what happened to Liverpool. Look what happened to these cities. Look what the Labour Party did. They destroyed everyone. They destroyed every one of those cities. They destroyed them and kept saying they were for the working man. Yeah, putting the working man on the dole. It was unbelievable. But they were godless. They were godless. Well, you vote for godless people, what do you expect is going to happen? Desolation. The unjust know no shame. So it continues. According to all I've appointed, they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. They are eager to corrupt their deeds. They'll corrupt everything. Not only the school system, not only the labor unions, not only the media, not only the government, they will corrupt the church and have done so. The best thing the Church of England can do for England is drop dead. It is dead morally and spiritually and theologically anyway. Wait for me, declares the Lord. I'm going to rise up as a witness. Now, that word there is, in the Septuagint, is martyrio. This is a messianic prophecy. Jesus was martyred. He bore witness to the sin of men. This is one of the verses in Zephaniah that does have application to the first coming of Christ. It goes on. Pour out my indignation, my burning anger. All the earth will be devoured. It's coming. You just look at it. I can talk to Singapore by Skype, or I can talk, to the United States or South Africa by Skype, or continental Europe by Skype. Doesn't matter where. Australia. It doesn't matter where I talk to by Skype. It's the same situation. It's the same situation globally. Notice the judgment is on a global scale. It's no longer epidemic, it's pandemic. It is everywhere. And it is being politicized. Those monkeys should have worn a mask and kept the social distance in those cages yesterday in San Diego. I want them. If you don't wear your mask and keep distance, we're not going to give you any coconuts or bananas. They're out of their mind. But something's going to happen. There will be those who call on the name of the Lord, but only after the judgment comes. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, my worshipers, my dispersed ones, will bring my offerings. It's always been interesting to me how many of the Falasha Jews, the black Jews from Ethiopia, the Falashas, how many of them were believers and are believers? Quite a number. And I'm not saying this is a specific prophecy about them, but it does have some relation to them. It goes on, in that day, you will feel no shame, because all of your deeds by which you have rebelled against me, for then I will remove from your midst your proud, exulting ones, and you will never again be haughty on my holy mountain. There are two kinds of people who need not experience a conviction characterized by shame. Those who are so backslidden they don't care anymore. And those who are so righteous, they have nothing to be ashamed about. Being shameless can be a good thing or a bad thing. Remember Adam and Eve, they were naked. There was nothing immoral about what they were doing. This arrogance, the haughtiness, the pride of man. But I will leave among you, in verse 12, a humble and lowly people. They will take refuge in the name of the Lord. The remnant of Israel will do no wrong and tell no lies, nor will a deceitful tongue be found in their mouths, for they will feed and lie down with no one to make them tremble. This had a partial fulfillment in the days of Zephaniah. A few of the poor of the land survived the 4 deportations of Nebuchadnezzar. Secondly, the faithful remnant of Israel at the first coming, Remember, Jesus told them, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, to flee. If you read Josephus, the Jewish believers who were the faithful people of Israel at that time in 70 AD, they were hidden. They escaped. They were taken to a place called Pila. Now, we address this subject, also known as Hierapolis, up in western Jordan, but right on the Jordan River, opposite Israel. Now, understand this. On the teaching we did some years ago, the hiding places of God, based on Zephaniah, we looked at the places where people were hid and protected. The cave of Adullam, the cave of Ein Gedi, Pila, Hierapolis, based on the warning of Jesus, when you see Jerusalem, flee to the mountains. We looked at the hiding places of God where God was safe. But then we had the hiding places of... There were hiding places of God where the people were safe. Those who followed the instructions of the Lord, like Jesus, when you see Jerusalem surrounded, flee to the mountains, and they made their way to Pila. There will, at the end of the age, be some kind of a refuge in Petra, prophetically, for the Jewish believers at that time. There was the cave of Adullam. There was David's hiding place in the cave of Ein Gedi. There are hiding places of God. But then there will be people seeking their own refuge, the hiding places of man, places like Masada and the Herodians. They never worked. Today we have people called survivalists. They think by going out to the Rocky Mountains in Montana or something like that, or the Canadian Rockies or something like that, and they take 100,000 rounds of ammunition, and and a couple of rifles up there, and they learn how to hunt and survive off the land, and they think they're going to be... The hiding places of man never work. There is no safety in the hiding places of man. There is only safety in the hiding places of God. Well, let's continue. The remnant of Israel, no one will make them tremble. Then it continues. Now notice, after all this imprecatory prediction of judgment, shout for joy, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O Israel. Rejoice and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. The Lord has taken away his judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst. You will fear no disaster no more. You'll fear it no more. And that day will be said to Jerusalem, do not be afraid, O Zion. Do not let your hands fall limp. The Lord your God is in your midst, a victorious warrior. He will exult over you with joy. He will be quiet in his love. He will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. I will gather those who grieve about the appointed feasts. They will come from you, O Zion. The approach of the exile is a burden on them. Behold, I'm going to deal at that time with all your oppressors. I will save the lame and gather the outcasts, and I will turn their shame into praise and renown in all the earth. At that time, I will bring you in, even at the time when I gather you together, the ingathering. Indeed, I will give you renown and praise among the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortune before your eyes, saith the Lord. Notice the climax and the ultimate theme of Zephaniah. Despite all of the predictions of doom and gloom, despite the dies irae, dies illa, despite all of that, The climactic theme is when the Lord restores your fortunes. Now, of course, these verses that we have in chapter 3, ranging from verse 14 through verse 20, have a national prophetic meaning for Israel, which is what we read in Zephaniah chapter 12, when the nations are gathered together against Israel. And the Lord comes back, and they look upon him who they have pierced. Zephaniah chapter 12 is the ultimate fulfillment of what Zephaniah chapter 3 closes with predicting. All these nations will come, Israel will be regathered, and Jesus, Yeshua, will be there and undertake for his people and restore Jerusalem in the millennial reign. Well, what's this mean for us? Look, the judgment is inevitable. I've been saying that for years. The judgment is inevitable. Interim periods of respite, yes, but ultimately the judgments are inevitable. However, that should not be our focus. Our focus should be the restoration. Our focus should be the promise of Christ's coming. That's our hope. He is our hiding place. All this other stuff is for the unbelieving nations and for backslidden Israel. For those who love the Lord, for the humble of the land, it's a message of hope and encouragement. Once again, it always comes down to what Jesus said. When you see these terrible things happening, lift up your head, your redemption draws near. Again, just think of the analogy the scripture gives us of maternal labor. No human being, no mother in her right mind enjoys contractions, birth contractions. Nobody can ever enjoy such a thing. Even things like epidurals only help a little bit. Episiotomies only help a little bit. Nobody likes these things. Nobody enjoys the experience of birth pangs. But what are you focusing on? The baby, the baby, the baby. The moment you get the baby, the rest no longer matters. The man-child will be born. That's how we have to think about it. That's how we have to think about it. Look at getting older. For a believer, your eyesight begins to dim, but your spiritual sight should be getting keener. Your hearing is not what it once was, but your hearing the voice of the Lord gets sharper. Your old body begins to break down, but the new one is being built. You look at the end of the year, the way God gave Israel the festivals, and Zephaniah talks about this. They are mourning because the festivals are not being observed correctly. Well, they were unto other gods and all sorts. Well, you look at this. The autumn means the summer is over. The autumn means the summer is over. But it has a beauty of its own, doesn't it? You can go to places like the Highlands of Scotland or Vermont or places like that, where the autumn is more beautiful than the summer. The leaves changing color. Things happening, it's getting colder, but it's getting prettier. Well, a believer should be like that. As they age in Christ, in proportion to aging biologically even, there's a different kind of beauty. Yeah, the summer's over, but the autumn has a beauty of its own. And ultimately, when it snows, so does winter. We need to think of it that way. When the winter's over, we're back to the first of Nisan, the beginning of the year. We're back to the Song of Solomon being read in the synagogues. We're back to new birth. We're back to new beginning, a new hope. Yeah, this place is going. No question, this place is going. Look what has happened to post-apartheid South Africa. Look at what has happened to that country. Now, you can say apartheid was unjust and it was bad for black people. It was, but not as bad as it is now. Not as bad as it is now. Things get worse. America's going. Britain, it's going. Things are going. European Union is falling to pieces. They're trying to make the iron stick to the clay. Everything's falling to pieces. What are you going to do? Don't focus on what is going. Focus on what is coming. In other words, we need to focus on who is coming. That faithful witness. He's coming. That needs to be our focus. Yes, verse after verse, imprecatory doom and gloom, judgment, decline, fall, ugliness, immorality, injustice, idolatry, verse after verse. But Zephaniah keeps coming back to the restoration, to the promise. Once something becomes so decrepit and broken down, you can't renovate it anymore. You can't use it anymore. Think of a public building. Sooner or later, you're going to need a new hospital, a new school, or a new library. You can't keep this old one going. It's condemned by the city, or it's a fire hazard. You just can't keep it going. The most you can do with a very old building is clear it out and turn it into a museum. But you just can't keep these things going. This doesn't work. You've got to think about making this thing last as long as we can, because the new one is under construction. We're living in this dilapidated house, this dilapidated building, this dilapidated community, this dilapidated country, this dilapidated world. We're living in something dilapidated. It's falling to pieces. We're trying to hold it together. How much can you use glue and duct tape to keep a house from corroding? Rather lousy. But the new one is under construction. There's a new one under construction. And when we look at Jesus, we can see it being built. The Lord in Zephaniah seemed to have withdrawn his presence from the nation. People couldn't see God's hand anymore. They began to think like the deists of the 18th century, that he's not going to involve himself. Whatever happens is going to depend on us, not on God, things like that. It seems like that. But the encouragement Zephaniah gives is, it's not like that. Don't think like the world. Don't think like the lost. Don't think like the unsaved. That's their worldview. That's their worldview. We need to have God's worldview. And God's worldview is a very good one indeed.